So the title of my talk this morning is The Way Out is In. And when I first heard that, I thought, what in the world are they talking about? But Thich Nhat Hanh is famously often said the way out is in. And it certainly sounds paradoxical, but I think you'll hopefully will see that it makes a lot of sense. You know, we are conditioned to seek solutions and happiness and all of that in the external world, to fix problems by changing our circumstances, by changing our possessions, our relationships, where we live, what we drive, whatever. You know, we look outward to fix our problems, to make our lives better. But the Buddha taught that that's not so. He offered a radical shift in perspective and suggested that true liberation from suffering lies not in manipulating or trying to control the external, but rather in undertaking a profound journey inward. And this inward journey is not about physical retreat from the world or withdrawing from the world, going and living in a cave in the Himalayas. It's about cultivating mindful awareness of our thoughts, emotions, and sensations, which we talk about here often. And it's along the lines of what we talked about on Wednesday when we were talking about inhabiting our lives. I mean, that's really what this is about. It's about understanding that the root of our suffering, which Buddhism defines as attachment, clinging, and grasping, um, is an internal process. You know that we have these desires and we have this illusion of a permanent self, and we crave pleasurable experiences. We resist unpleasant ones, and we cling to the idea of a fixed identity. And all three of those things create suffering in our lives. You know, this constant grasping of the pleasurable, pushing away of the unpleasant creates a cycle of dissatisfaction, a cycle of suffering, what's called in Buddhism and the Pali samsara. You may have heard that term. I like to translate samsara as running around in circles. I'm not sure that's quite what the Buddha had in mind, but to me, that sort of sums it up. Chasing our own tails, looking for relief from our suffering, looking externally, looking at trying to control things externally that we can't control, clinging, attaching to things being other than they actually are. So the way out is in calls for us to break free from this cycle, and by focusing inward through practices that we talk about all the time, meditation, mindfulness, we begin to observe our thoughts, our feelings, our internal experiences without judgment. We recognize their impermanent nature. We accept them as they are, as they arise and pass away. Because when we learn to detach and not be overly identified with that stuff and simply observe it, we detach it, we see the constant chatter in our mind. We develop a sense of equanimity in the face of life's ups and downs. Stephen Batchelor, he's a teacher I very much admire. He's a British teacher. He was previously a monk for many years. I'm going to talk about some of his teachings more in a couple of weeks. But he's been a really major influence in my own practice. He says that the absence of reactivity. He defines nirvana as the absence of reactivity in the face of life's ups and downs. Once we can tame the reactivity, he said that's when we're really there in terms of having a peaceful, serene life, and not some mystical altered state, but the absence of reactivity. In other words, this inward journey that I'm talking about this morning is not about achieving a state of blissful ignorance where we just walk around, in this cloud of joy and pleasure. It's about cultivating wisdom and compassion, but in the real world. This is where we have to bring it. And that's why it is so challenging. If we all went off and lived in a monastery, it might be a little easier because we don't have all the distractions of the media, of having to pay bills and fight traffic and get to the store and deal with a gazillion other challenges. But by understanding the impermanence of all things, we learn to appreciate the present moment more fully. because we know it won't last. Oh, I'm really enjoying this. I'm going to really focus in on it and appreciate it because I know it's not going to be here in a little while. When I cling to it and insist that it continue, then I'm going to suffer because it isn't going to last. And then additionally, by recognizing our interconnectedness with all things, that we don't have a fixed self, we develop a deeper sense of compassion and equanimity. If I feel like, you and I are a part of each other, it's going to be a lot easier for me to feel compassion and empathy. If I feel you're separate, if I other you, you're less than me or you're different than me, then it's going to be much harder to cultivate that compassion and empathy for you. Now, let me be clear, this may sound simple, but it's not. This path inward, and I know most of us know this, is not easy because it requires patience, it requires discipline, and most importantly, often, I think it requires the courage to confront the deepest and darkest parts of ourselves, the parts we just as soon ignore, disavow, push off to the side, pretend aren't there. But by looking at all that, by cultivating patience, discipline, and the courage to look at all of ourselves, the potential rewards are immeasurable in terms of just living a different, more equanimous life. Because by cultivating inner peace and understanding it, we not only liberate ourselves from suffering, we become a source of peace and compassion in the world. And that is contagious. It bleeds on the people we come in contact with. So we become sort of missionaries of compassion, missionaries of peace in the world. And I love that about this practice. And in a world consumed by external pursuits and getting more stuff and achieving more things and climbing more mountains or whatever, the Buddhist message of the way out is in offers a profound and timely reminder that true freedom and peace and happiness lie within us, not somewhere outside of us. And yet our culture constantly tries to get us to pursue it outside of us. It's part of the consumerism, it's part of just the whole Western culture. But remember, in Buddhist teachings, the root cause of suffering is seen as our attachment to impermanent things and our misperception of reality, of always wanting to have things be the way we want them to be. Well, guess what? We don't have that kind of control over the universe. We cling to desires, we push away aversions, we have this false sense of self, which only leads to this cycle, this samsara of dissatisfaction and pain. And this is one of the many, many brilliant insights that the Buddha offers us. Because he taught that through these practices and through self inquiry, we begin to see through the illusions that cloud our perception. We see things more clearly. I went through so much of my life just on autopilot, thinking things should be the way I wanted them, not seeing things clearly, always clinging to how they should be, how I wanted them to be, and I did nothing but suffer because none of that worked. So with this practice, we discover the inherent peace and clarity that lies within. We develop a more balanced and equanimous relationship with our own experiences. And at the end of the day, we become more comfortable in our own skin. We're not walking around having to protect a false self. We're not walking around having to protect an image and always be on. We see that in reality, we are inseparable from the ever-changing flow of life. Life is always moving, and we're always moving with it. And I think this insight is profoundly liberating. It frees us from the burden of trying to control and manipulate reality and the future just to suit our desires or our own agenda or our own stories that we've been talking about. The way out of suffering then is not a matter of escaping to some external refuge or new toy or distracting ourselves with busyness or running away from life. Rather, it is fully embracing and investigating our present moment experience. And here's the rub. No matter how challenging or uncomfortable it may be, That's where the courage piece kicks in. We have to be willing to put up with some discomfort when we look at the uncomfortable stuff. And I can tell you from my own experience, it's not a lot of fun, but the payoff is tremendous by turning inward toward our difficulties. By turning with an open and curious attitude, we begin to transform our relationship to those difficulties. We face them. We discover the inherent freedom and wholeness that is our true nature. Once I could sort of make friends with the parts of myself that I'm not too fond of, and I use the term friends loosely there, I didn't have to expend so much energy always covering up, excusing them, explaining them, hiding from them. I could just say, okay, yeah, that's part of me. I'm working on it, but I'm not exhausted trying to pretend it's not there. And as I said earlier, this is not easy. It involves confronting deep-seated patterns of thought and behavior. And we all have it. We all have this dysfunctional vein that runs through us. I mean, it's part of the human experience because our parents imparted it to us, their parents imparted it to them. Nobody gets it 100% right. So the concept of the way out is in points to a profound truth that the solution to our suffering does not lie outside. It lies within our own hearts and minds. And by turning inward with mindfulness and compassion, we begin to unravel those knots of attachment and delusion. We begin to untangle those knots. The Buddha talked about getting tangled up in all of our own delusions. We discover the inherent freedom and joy that is our birthright. We just have to pursue it. We have to set an intention. And while the path is challenging, and that goes without saying, it is ultimately, I think, the only way to find true fulfillment in this life, everything else notwithstanding. So that's the way out is in.